So when I approached this question of metropolitan economies in historical context, Andrew Weiss was a tremendous influence through the first decade of my writing. His book on African-American suburbanization opened the door for people to begin to even understand the kinds of questions I try to ask. And so in that sense, he introduced me to a lot of the work of scholars at Brown University that talked about metropolitan studies, that it was no longer a question of cities in tension with their surrounding suburbs or the loss explicitly of the rural countryside, but how did those three modalities, those three typologies coexist and take on different shapes over time? And so in looking at metropolitan studies, what I found in the last decade was the need to bridge the gap with economics as a field, that too often the models I found that economists offered were ahistorical. They did not engage in great detail with the actual historical evidence or record, let alone what historians had done with the primary sources that had survived. And so much of my work in the last 10 years has been looking at the kind of metropolitan landscape, but looking at the economic transformation of that landscape due to the construction of infrastructure, roadways, electrical grids, freshwater, sewer water systems. How does this then impact and provide a massive incentive for the way that what we consider modern, or what my colleagues have described as brutal scapes or blendscapes or blandscapes, how have those things been a product of the way that the economies work and their social impact? And so when I draw that back before the Second World War, before the advent of the Cold War, you start to see some striking evolutions of the typologies and how the land use evolved in these three particular cases, New Jersey, Mississippi, and Indiana. And I hope that my findings will provide some interesting points of conversation moving forward. And so my premise was largely summarized by the introduction to tonight's conversation, is that urban studies in this context has been somewhat misaligned and out of focus when it comes to consider the periphery. That seeing the countryside as something of marginal interest, of passing curiosity, but the real story was the downtown and the evolution of the transportation systems, the major industrial investments of the late 19th and early 20th century. It obscures some important patterns that I think we can now interrogate further through a seminar like this one. And so by starting from the outside in, we start to appreciate more the sense of all the different kinds of metropolitan space as they've existed over the last 2 or 3 centuries, at least, if not back into the medieval and ancient worlds as well. And so that's my opening point, is to say we need to do more events like this one. We need to expand this lens of inquiry as we move forward together as scholars. And this piece about misalignment, by looking at the major cities and their records, I understand, I get it, that Chicago presents an enormous treasure in terms of the records and the materials and the planning documents, the architectural developments. It's impossible to ignore. But within that, as we look at places in North America, whether it's Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, Toronto or Vancouver, the relevance is clear, but it doesn't negate the importance of the countryside. It doesn't negate the importance of their surrounding suburbs and their different social and political functions over the last 100 or 150 years. And so this event, in offering us a scholarly shift towards understanding the periphery to the suburb, cannot just be a complement to the urban core. It's time for a wholesale reevaluation. And so I want to start a little bit, and spend some time on the first case that I encountered was New Jersey. New Jersey basically was an agricultural state, and it then underwent a massive transformation in the middle of the 20th century. It had had smaller urban centers, I guess the largest one being Newark, but really its other major urban centers in Camden and Trenton and Atlantic City were 19th century mill towns that essentially grew slowly, if not stagnated, by 1920. And so New Jersey, in Ben Franklin's terms, famously called it a keg tapped at both ends. That in Franklin's sense of the state, it was between Philadelphia and New York, and really all of the economic and social energy that animated those two cities pulled away from the countryside of New Jersey. And so there was this kind of contempt for New Jersey as the Garden State. And so what I hoped to put forward here is a bit of the research I had done on New Jersey. This took over 15 years. But the core understanding is that New Jersey adopted a system of industrial planning through the 1920s and 1930s, and then expanded it dramatically in the 1940s and 50s to maximize its prosperity as a peripheral region, that it was never going to be competitive with New York or Philadelphia, but in fact, as a complementary region, could in fact benefit from all of the economic spillover. And it inverts Franklin's metaphor. New Jersey becomes a vacuum for revenue and for population that sucks people out of New York City and out of Philadelphia through the middle of the 20th century. And in this sense, the agriculture had been the primary economic activity for New Jersey for its history up until 1940. But with the expansion of real estate markets and using higher leverage financial tools after 1950, suburbs became the core of the New Jersey economy. It was a way that commuters could travel back and forth to the urban centers, and their consumer spending would then animate the expansion of the state's economy. The federal government then subsidized metropolitan commercial development in the state with the creation of the New Jersey Turnpike and the Garden State Parkway in the 1950s and 60s. This then expanded both service and technical markets in the urban core that then relied on suburban commuters. In my work, I looked at the region kind of in the middle of the state, outside of Trenton, as Monmouth and Ocean counties, where it was all residential and then strip mall suburban commercial development that characterized the region. In this particular map that we generated back in 2016, New Jersey had a $2.7 trillion economy, that whole counties were generating billions of dollars in revenue based on these suburban developments. And so in this case, from my experience, New Jersey was a peripheral center. That is, there were these cities that were the heart of economic activities and industrial investment, but instead the residential and the population growth made New Jersey the highest per capita in terms of residential density in the United States. There were more people who lived there per square mile than anywhere else in the nation. And so how did that happen? That was somewhat intentional. In contrast, when I began to see and look around the rest of the United States as to how typical was New Jersey, or how different was it from other states, the most stark contrast I found was in Mississippi. Mississippi embodied an agricultural rejection of peripheral development. And so in this case, Mississippi basically tried to preserve as close to it could as an agricultural economy based on slavery in 1860. Small local markets, the lack of centralized planning, the resistance to being able to even zone local areas kept Mississippi as a kind of underdeveloped state right into the 21st century. Indiana, in contrast, presents the most challenging model. And I'm going a little bit quickly. I could talk more about Mississippi, but I want to leave time for everyone else. The model that Indiana embraces through the 20th century is agricultural preservation within peripheral development, that it borders on Chicago, but it wants nothing like the large industrial market creation that Chicago experiences between 1870 and 1930. It also resists the creation of mid-sized urban centers as seen in neighboring Ohio. It does not want to create a Cleveland or a Columbus or a Cincinnati. Instead, the state systematically subsidizes agricultural industry growth, large-scale industrial companies like ADM in the 20th century, and managed a balanced geography of small-scale urbanization. That the largest city is the capital, Indianapolis, with just over 500,000 residents, but no other city is over 250,000. And so the spread of small cities intentionally as a matter of public policy was striking in its attempt to keep a very rural and agricultural marketplace. In this context of what we're doing here today, as we look at the themes of blandscapes, brutalscapes, and blendscapes, we see them manifest in three different ways in these three different locations. The theoretical categories must be nuanced when we consider the historical evidence. For planners and architects in New Jersey during the middle of the 20th century, rural areas were blandscapes. It was empty territory designed to be built over. And they did it. They built these massive highways. They built these expansive regional malls. They became the brutalscapes that if you are not a prosperous middle-class homeowner, there is no citizenship standing for you. You are a burden on the society. And that the expansion of those suburban landscapes, those brutalscapes, eventually dominated the state as an emergent blendscape, that New Jersey was no longer a garden state, but a suburban state, and that it was defined by massive consumption, driven by residents who no longer wanted to live in New York or Philadelphia. In contrast, Mississippi and Indiana both committed to resist this process of suburbanization and metropolitan growth, preserving their 19th century brutalscapes, the spaces that look like plantations or large industrial agricultural centers, as they desired them as both a landscape and a blendscape, that this is a place that they considered normal and would not see it threatened, even at the cost of massive amounts of profit. These places remain on the kind of periphery of global urban history. Transnational investment has brought these places to the center of future urban growth. If you are to travel through these areas now, you'll see large firms like Amazon and Google purchasing enormous tracts of land for distribution centers. And so the transnational digital world economy is now redefining peripheral centralities that are simultaneously bland, brutal, and blended. And so this work is continuing, and I think there's an important feature coming in the next 10 years here in the Mississippi River Valley, stretching across Montana in the west and back to Pittsburgh in the east and down to New Orleans. But if you have more questions, please feel free to call me, reach out to me by email, or contact me through the university website. And I am very thankful to all of my colleagues who continue to do this work and have shaped the content that I've been able to present here today with just a few of the resources. And I'm glad to send along this PDF to anyone who wants it, or if it can be part of the conference record, I'm glad to make sure it's there. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Walter. We're humbled by your taking the 3 Bs that we had thrown out to unbelievable heights. We're happy that they came to life in this very first presentation. Thank you so much for the depth and geographical breadth that you displayed in your opening comments. We have crossed the entire American continent and more than 100 years and even more of history, and got to know brutal and blendscapes during both all these geographies and time periods. So much more to say, and I hope some people in the audience will want to ask you some questions or make some comments. Floor is open.
Hi, Roger, can I ask a question?
Yes, please, Julie.
Hi.
The baby's still awake.
Oh, yes, she's full of energy at the moment. Yeah, great presentation. My question is simple. Who were the factors besides the different girls' paths of the three different cities he presented? Are they local governments or the people or? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. And I saw David Sloan also very kindly threw a question for me as well. So the people that are acting here, what's very striking to me is how deeply elected officials turn towards educated planners in New Jersey relatively early in the 20th century and kind of embraced it as a way to escape being in the shadow of these larger cities. And so there's a sense of competition, I think, with proximity to urban planning that drove the sense of how New Jersey wanted to structure its own forms of growth. With Mississippi, the hostility is impossible to overstate. State level legislatures moved aggressively to defend the structure of a plantation system that stretched back prior to 1800. And so there's just a hostility to planning, even in a city like Jackson, even in the capital, where there were attempts to kind of organize how to manage and maintain roadways and sewer systems. The state legislature as a body never wanted to see Jackson become a dominant city in the region. And so there was just overt, document after document, hostility among state legislatures against any kind of urban or metropolitan growth. That's what struck me as so strange in Indiana, is that there's not the same level of overt hostility, but the state legislatures kind of decided, okay, we can use some of these techniques of land management to make sure our large agricultural firms continue to grow and tap into new markets as the national economy grows. But we're not going to allow this to turn into a way that Indianapolis comes to dominate the landscape, or Evanston, or even out by Purdue, West Lafayette. They want to keep all these places relatively small, and the priority is to maintain small towns. And so for me, the center of the story are always the state legislators and the different approaches, the different visions they had in these three places. For David, why do you think Indiana was so different from Ohio? Yeah, it's still something I'm finding more documents around. They're much more hostile to Chicago. And so in that sense, it's different from the way New Jersey elected officials looked at New York and Philadelphia and then sought to emulate or adapt those ideas. In Indiana, the discussions around limiting the impact of Chicago on, say, Gary begins to grow, and then they move very aggressively to kind of prevent its expansion. That's, on the one hand, kind of the western part of the state maintaining its agricultural base. But when you look to the east, and then this question about Ohio, you would think there might have been more understanding, the sense of kind of shared connection about the way that they go about this. But I think both Cleveland and Cincinnati were places they looked at very skeptically, probably not as hostile, and I also think there was a different sense of folks who migrated out of Kentucky into Indiana, particularly Southern Indiana, that might have had this influence in the State House about having a stronger influence to maintain a more rural, small town kind of state through the middle and second half of the 20th century. But I've only seen a few of those documents. So that sense of the Kentucky connection, Kentucky and Ohio do have a much more contentious kind of border relationship than Kentucky and Indiana. So that's my main instinctive answer from the documents I've seen, that the receptiveness to folks moving from Kentucky and Indiana also carried with it some of the resistance to follow what was happening in Ohio.
So Indiana was the center of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, just as urban planning is really expanding across the United States. Is this really more about, I mean, obviously Ohio, Chicago, other places have very deep conflicted racial issues, but is this really the state legislature of Indiana, in some sense, kowtowing to and setting a platform for something that extends for a very long time to a white supremacist agenda?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's a great point to highlight. The center of the second Ku Klux Klan is Indiana. People tend to look at the organizing base in Georgia and incidentally also quite prominent in New Jersey, just behind Indiana. But no, the role of the Klan as a social, local political force in the state, yeah, that's something I can get behind. I really do see, you know, you had 70% of the people in the 1920s elected to state or local office were Ku Klux Klan members. And so it was a just huge influence in maintaining a sense of deep conservatism, that any kind of social change, even if it led to higher profitability, then they're not going to buy into the kind of tax rateables argument that we'll see within kind of later markets of why you want to grow larger firms in a particular area. So yeah, I do believe that the strength of the Klan politically in the state would have contributed to a sense of keeping a small town set of economies as the norm for the state of Indiana as long as possible. And you still see it today when you see, you know, I guess by the 80s, the emergence of Dan Quayle, in the last 10, 20 years, the success of Mike Pence. You know, they all have that same kind of root that stretches way back early in the 20th century, if not earlier.
Thank you, Walter. We have at least time for another question. Paul McGinn has a question.
Thanks, Walter. As you know, I've got a connection to New Jersey when I was a student, when we spoke earlier in the year. One of the interesting things about Jersey, given its juxtaposition between New York and Philadelphia, is that it's a stigmatized state in many senses. It's kind of seen as a very kind of secondary or tertiary state, despite the fact that, you know, a lot of the population there are migrants who have fled from the urban in both Philly and New York and so forth. Can you comment about that kind of spatial stigma that goes with the kind of the peripheral centrality that is New Jersey?
So yeah, so anybody familiar with cable television will know that the stigma that's attached to New Jersey goes to the shore communities and the sense of young immigrant children partying, getting drunk, you know, having wild sex parties everywhere they can along the beach. And so the sense of debauchery is a piece that has shaped the last 40 years. And I shouldn't say that, like, it actually stretches back to the 1870s. Long Branch at the shore was the Las Vegas of the time, when you had presidents go and party with publishers and bankers and all of the theater starlets and singers of the time, and gamble on horse racing, engage in all different kinds of prostitution, abuse of alcohol. There's just a long history of just very sordid activities in New Jersey at the shore, and even more so in places like the Pine Barrens that were, you know, there were no rail lines. You had to take carriages to get out there. And so New Jersey was an escape and a recreational escape at best. And so my colleague, Bryant Simon at Temple, writes about the Boardwalk Empire and the way Atlantic City kind of taps into all of that and the corruption, the scandal. If Frank Sinatra said, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere about New York, New Jersey became the spot where, you know, the failure of people, even in organized crime, where a mythological figure like Tony Soprano couldn't really cut it in New York. And the rivalry and the tension ultimately destroys the idea of a New Jersey mob relative to a New York or a Boston or a Philadelphia mob. And the insecurity of suburban residents, commuters that then move there and come to dominate the state, that's profound. the New Jerseyans who have come to dominate the suburbs of that state, they are very paranoid that, they couldn't really cut it in the larger urban center and succeed in lower Manhattan. It made Donald Trump enormously popular as a public figure in the state, to this point that he's still kind of the champion in many of these regions. And so you're very correct to point to this kind of secondary or tertiary perception of New Jersey and how there's just a fundamental insecurity in the state, from the governor right down to your local dog catcher, that, we're here because we couldn't really make it someplace else. And so New Jersey on the periphery is trying to, and you do have large numbers of immigrant populations. I think of Edison Township in particular, tons of South Asian migrants, thousands of people from East Asia. That's changing that and making this kind of the embodiment of their American dream. But that's still a very contested rhetorical space and symbolic area. That immigrants see this as the dream destination, but families that have been there for multiple generations feel much more insecure about what they've given away by having to live out in the suburbs.